In this module, we will be talking about texture, another element of art. Texture is a valuable element in the artist's toolbox as it engages another sense besides vision, the sense of touch. Texture is the surface quality of an object. As such, it is tactile. That is, it appeals to our sense of touch. There are two types of texture, visual or implied texture, and real texture or physical texture. Texture is related to value, in that it's created by modifying the light on a surface. It is also related to rhythm, as it often creates or recreates patterns that are found everywhere in nature. Jean Dubuffet is an artist that explored various different techniques to incorporate texture in his artworks. So much so that the subject of many of his paintings and prints is solely texture, such as in the series Texturologies, a large collection of paintings, prints, and drawings. Here's another artwork by Dubuffet. This texture looks real. It is not a real texture, though, but implied texture. It takes a lot of experimenting with techniques and learning about materials to achieve these results. Sometimes artists use big chunks of paint applied with a spatula or palette knife, a technique called impasto. Eventually, if there is enough amount of paint, it will crackle, an outcome that is called alligator skinning. Leon Kossoff's Shell Building, 1962, is a good example of this technique. It is a regular-size painting, but heavy due to the amount of paint. Sometimes artists will scratch and sand a surface, and other techniques such as rubbing surfaces with charcoal or ink. Sari Daina's HPFS circa 1953 is a good example of this technique. The artist went around town rubbing ink against paper on every surface that she could find. Rubbings are a little bit like detective work in that your goal is to extract as much information as possible out of interesting surfaces. Calligraphy is a printing process in which a textured surface is inked up and pressed against a piece of paper. Julia Phillips's Expanded 5, 2016, is a calligraph with amazing technique. Notice the incredible amount of fine detail. Implied texture can be achieved with just pen and ink, with the use of repeated lines, hatching, or stippling. Jean Dubuffet's Textural Transcription 1, 1958, is a good example of implied texture done simply with a pen and a good amount of tireless work. Is it a piece of animal skin, or a microscopic view of some living organism's cells? What do you think? Here's another artwork done with the same simple technique, pen and ink on paper. Landscape, 1952, by Jean Dubuffet could be a bird's-eye view of any city, as it could be a close view of some surface, maybe some kind of stone. This is lots of work, but it pays off. The results can be incredible. Artists sometimes also incorporate sand and other exotic materials to the canvas to explore real texture. Jean Dubuffet's Place for Awakenings, 1960, is a good example of this. The artist added pebbles and sand to his painting, using plastic paste as a binder. Here's another artwork by Jean Dubuffet titled The Ragman, 1954. This time around, it's a sculpture. It is made of a piece of found slag. A slag is a dross or scoria of some metal and the byproduct of smelting raw ore. How would you describe the texture in this sculpture? Is it slick and smooth or rough and scratchy? Is it real or implied? Yayoi Kusama's Accumulation No. 1, 1962, is made of stuffed fabric, which the artist painted and sewn to a chair fringe. How would you describe this texture? Does it look silky and smooth or prickly but soft instead? Would you risk sitting on it? This is Merritt Oppenheim's Object Paris, 1936. It is made of a found cup, saucer, and spoon, all covered in fur. There's a little story behind this artwork. Oppenheim used fur coats all the time, and a friend of hers suggested that she should cover everything with it. She obviously took up on his suggestion. When looking at this example of found object art, what kind of feelings do you get? Can you imagine drinking from a cup covered with fur? Roni Horn took several close-up pictures of the Thames River for a series titled Some Thames, Group C, 2000. You may have noticed that the surface of the sea changes quite a bit depending on the weather. Sometimes it's rough, while at others it's mirror-like, and sometimes it's just hard to describe with words. You can't really feel the texture of the sea by touching it, and you certainly wouldn't want to rub ink on a piece of paper against its surface. And unlike rock, The textures generated by the elements on the sea surface are ephemeral, but you can capture them by freezing a given moment using photography. By the way, does this artwork remind you of a famous analogy involving a river? Paul Strand's Rock Textures, 1927, is another great example of how texture can be conveyed with simple means. Tonal value is all you need to properly represent a rough surface. You can touch a rock and feel its texture as opposed to the sea surface, which you can feel by looking but not by touching. However, not all textures that you can feel by touching can easily be transferred to a piece of paper. The extremely rough texture of the rock depicted in this black and white photograph is one such example.